morning, Green Spring. Well, today we have our Who's Who, and we're going to be talking with Chuck Harding. And Chuck Harding is the guy that you see walking around the campus with his head thrust forward. Looks like he knows where he's going. He's very busy. He works in the woodshop group, the country and folk singing group, and probably half a dozen others. He's also a member of the resident council, and he's liaison to the sales and information directorate. So he's a busy man. But before we get into your career, Chuck, I'd like to learn a little bit more about your early family life. What was it like when you grew up? Who your parents were? What did they do?
Well, my parents, mom was Barbara. Everybody called her Barbie, and so did we. And Dad was Mart. That's one of the my name is actually Mart, but
now, Mart's an interesting M-A-R-T-T.
Right.
That must be a family name or something.
Well, it used to be a family last name with one T.
Oh.
My dad's name was actually Reuben Mart Harding, but you know he went by Mart or Red, you know, before he got as bald as he ended up, and so he always went by Pa at home.
Yeah.
And it was an interesting upbringing because Mom was one of these people who absolutely could not sit still.
Ah.
And shortly after well, let's see, I'm not sure where you wanted to start. I was born in Kingston, Pennsylvania in 1943. Dad was off in North Africa, I think, at that point.
So what was he? He was in one of the military services?
Right, he was in 15th Air Force, I think, but maybe it was 3rd Air Force. Sorry, I'm not a historian. He was a wing weather officer, at least that's what he ended up doing. He had been a statistician, was his degree work, and then when he got back from the war, he went to University of North Carolina. He'd always give me a hard time because I'd say NC State because that was, and apparently
there's a difference.
Apparently those two outfits don't like each other a whole lot.
That's right.
So he'd always correct me. But anyway, well.
So he got his an advanced degree from the University of North Carolina.
Right.
What was his major?
It was in statistics, but you know, I'm not real sure. He was going to do a PhD, but apparently they didn't feel like he'd done a good enough job, and so he ended up with a master's and didn't go beyond that. But it was in statistics. He was one of these people who's got a real head for math. Yeah. Too bad I didn't get it for engineering, but you know, I didn't get a head for math.
What was his career?
Well, he worked for Central Intelligence Agency, and so the short answer is, I don't know.
You don't know,
and if I knew, I couldn't tell you anyway.
I understand. All right.
But Mom was, as I said, Mom was somebody who simply couldn't sit still. She started up a kindergarten and daycare at the family home after we'd moved to Northern Virginia in December of '50.
Where were you in Northern Virginia?
We were in Herndon.
Herndon, okay.
And so she felt like that was a good thing to do, and it made the family life a little bit chaotic because every morning we'd convert part of the downstairs into the school area, and every afternoon we'd convert it back.
Okay.
It wasn't until long after that I realized other people's family lives were a little more settled, perhaps.
I see, yeah.
But that was okay.
And she also had a dance studio?
Well, she taught dance and that. Dance she sort of gave up on around 1960 or 65 because she began to have trouble with it. She did toe dancing and that sort of thing, and it got to the point where it hurt her knees and toes. But she continued, the Harding Hall, as it was called, continued until she was, it went for 52 years, and I think she was well into her early 80s before that shut down. And then she taught with the county school system for about 25 years.
Any of your parents still living?
Mom is still alive. Dad died in 97, I believe is correct. Complications of diabetes and lost a piece of one leg. You don't want diabetes if you can help it. Mom is doing relatively well, considering that she's 93, headed for 94 this October.
I would think you're one of few people in Green Spring who has a mother or one of the parents still living.
Well,
you know,
when we decided to move to Green Spring, I kidded Mom that there was something wrong with this picture. You know, she was in an old folks home and I was moving to an old folks home.
I see.
But
Of course, you don't think of it as an old folks' home now, do you?
Well, it sure doesn't feel like it. Well, it's funny. When we were talking about moving here, we had probably the same conversation as everybody does. You say, wow, I'm used to living by myself in a single-family home. Why would I want to move here? I'm not used to being in a group living situation. But, if you get a little realistic about it and you say, well, okay, but I can see that we're beginning to slow down. We put stuff off. We're going to have to start hiring all this work done that we used to do ourselves. It's not all that much fun to get up on the roof anymore and clean off the leaves and stuff like that. Maybe this would make good sense.
Well, we'll talk about that a little later.
Okay. All right.
Your siblings.
Yeah.
What about your siblings?
Well, I have 3 brothers and a sister. Okay. I have twin brothers, brothers who are twins, if you will. They're almost identical, not quite, right? But boy, they were so close to identical when we were,
so they had some fun,
kids.
Didn't they?
Yeah, they probably did. Howard and Todd. Howard ended up going to, he went into the Air Force and stayed in the Air Force. He flew radar navigator and bombardier on B-52s out of K.I. Sawyer up in Michigan. Yeah. And he stayed in the upper peninsula. They live up in Marquette. And then Todd, who was in the Army, mostly in various security-related stuff, stayed in for a while. He ended up getting caught in one of the rifts that they had. So he's been in the private version of security one way or another. He lives out in Reston. And it's funny, just as an offside, because you and I had never discussed this, I think. Both of his boys enjoy music. One enjoys music a lot. He became a concert pianist.
Oh boy.
So you never know. And then I have a sister who's a doctor. She lives down in Valdosta, Georgia. She's a general practitioner. And then a little brother who runs Harding Automotive out in Herndon, and he lives out in Purcellville. So he and I sort of do tag team taking care of Mom, and Todd joins in when he can.
Oh, he's out close to her then.
But he's almost on his way to work, so he can stop by and see her, and he does most mornings.
That's good.
So it works out pretty well.
Well, what about your elementary school, high school? Anything special about that?
Well, I have to say, it seems to me that it was eminently forgettable, because I have managed to forget most of it. But, I went to Herndon Elementary. That was perfectly okay. Went to Herndon High School for the first 2 years. But, I think I was, smart enough sounds overinflated, but I didn't have to work too hard to get through school. And somehow I'd never developed any real idea of what I wanted to do when I grew up. So I didn't study particularly hard. And this irritated the daylights out of my parents, and they
I understand.
They ended up sending me to St. Stephen's in Alexandria for a couple of years, last 2 years in high school, hoping I would shape up. Unfortunately, I suspect it did more to drain their wallets than it did to put anything in my head. And I got into college, but kind of by the skin of my teeth.
Now, you were in the band in the high school? Or?
Well, when I was at Herndon, I was in the band. Yeah. Actually, I think the band may have gone back into the upper reaches of elementary school, because I'm sure it was more than 2 years. Yeah. And I enjoyed that, but I didn't work on it. No. So I played the clarinet and the euphonium, and eventually ended up on bass clarinet and tried the oboe.
Not many people played the euphonium.
Well, I mean, different sizes of brass instruments.
Sue Frankie's husband played the euphonium in the Marine Band.
Ah, okay. Yeah. Well, I played them badly, all of them.
All right. Well, now you got out of high school, though, and then you went to Ohio Wesleyan.
Uh-huh.
And did you have a major there? Or?
Well, my major was nominally going to be major in physics and minor in Russian.
Oh.
Because, a lot of physics was done in Russian in those days, and it seemed to make good sense. Well, it didn't take a whole lot of time to discover that I was never going to have a career in physics, because I can't help using my hands here. I'm a person who likes to understand how things work, and I like to visualize things as opposed to concepts. And so much of physics nowadays it really can only be understood with the underlying math. And when I hit things like quantum mechanics, I said, something can exist as both a particle and a wave, and if you hold it still, it disappears. I don't like things like
But on
this.
the other hand, physics is the basics.
Yeah.
The basis of the basic physics, let's say,
Yeah.
is the basis of engineering. It's the basis of
It absolutely
most everything,
is.
of knowing how things
Right.
work. you
No,
know.
it absolutely is.
Yeah.
It made good sense. It was a reasonable choice. I just didn't realize that I basically have no real understanding of mathematics. I mean, yeah, I can turn the crank, but I'm not a person who enjoys math for the beauty of its proofs.
You don't.
know,
I just don't understand it. Well, did you have any active duty? Well, any active duty or in the military? Were you in the military?
Well, I was in the military for 4 years.
Oh.
You know, I ended up, not one of the best portions of my life, but I ended up flunking out of Ohio Wesleyan after
Okay.
about three years. And it just, you know, if you don't study, you don't excel.
Yeah,
there's no question about that.
A lot of people haven't learned that. You know?
Well, I would have been a whole lot smarter, and
Yeah.
I obviously wasn't at the time, to take a few years off before going to college and work and see if I had some idea what I wanted to do.
You know, that's a good point because if you'd gone to the military before you went to college, you probably would have had something in mind that you really wanted to do,
Yeah.
and you really would have studied.
Right.
You know.
No, I think it's true. It's 20/20 hindsight,
Yeah.
no question
yeah,
about it.
yeah.
Well, I was in the Air Force. You know, at that time, this was '64. Vietnam was boiling merrily, and your odds of getting drafted were pretty good.
About 64.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I said, well, okay, you know, with apologies to everybody who was in the Navy, I'm going to be enlisted because they didn't get my degree. I do not like bell-bottom pants. I'm not going in the Navy.
Oh, okay.
You know, I'm not real.
I understand that too.
I'm not real fond of digging holes, so I don't think I'll go in the Army.
That's different.
And so I went in the Air Force, or as some of my buddies referred to it, who'd been, you know, Mustangs, and they said, well, you know, it's the Air Farce, right? You know, but hey, you know, it was an interesting 4 years, and you know, it taught me a lot. If nothing else, it exposed me to a lot of people who were radically different from me.
Yeah.
You know, different backgrounds, and it showed me, you know, there are a lot of different ways to live your life, and a lot of different points of view, and you better get used to it because everybody's not like you.
Yeah. Now you spent your time in England,
Yeah, I didn't realize how lucky I was until later, but you know, I was posted to England for the 3 years after I got out of tech school, and this was, I didn't realize it at the time, but this was my introduction to living in windowless areas. You know, I was in.
okay.
You know, I was in base comms and crypto maintenance.
Yeah.
All that stuff was pretty highly classified, and so, you know, it's all in locked areas, and you get used to wearing a badge and signing your life away on various security releases. But there was kind of a fun part of that, in addition to just the work, which was mostly boring, but sometimes entertaining. We worked on airborne command post aircraft. They were converted KC-135s or 707s in the civilian world.
Yeah.
And that was interesting work, but especially when you were working on them at 3 a.m. That was when I learned to sort of drink coffee.
Is that
when the ready truck came around to bring you tools and stuff, the only thing they had to drink that was hot was coffee. So if you didn't like it, too bad.
Did you participate in any local activities in England? Did you get to know English, or is it all?
Well, interestingly enough, yes. You know, I knew a few people, but oddly enough, I spent a fair amount of time square dancing in England because they have quite an active community there. And I got to know a couple of the callers. I built a monitor for one of the callers I knew who lived down in London, a guy named Tommy Cavanaugh. He introduced me to the accordion, which I learned to play, sort of.
Yeah.
But it was interesting.
Yeah. Well, you know, I you know, got to meet people outside too. So I just wondered, is frequently people who go in the military go to the base and they really don't venture off and they don't know other people or the people of the country. And
yeah.
I think it's kind of nice to do that.
Well, I was lucky because we had, and now I don't remember what it was called, but on the enlisted side of the outfit, there was a recreation club, and the guy who ran it had somehow gotten involved with a couple English groups which did square dancing. And I knew a couple people, wow, it's been a long time, Sergeant Sirer, Jim Sirer and his wife, and a couple others. Sorry, this is like 40 years ago. I've forgotten a lot of this. But it was interesting. So then we got to go out and meet people. There was a woman that I got to know pretty well, and some of her friends who lived out in Bury St. Edmunds, which was about 12, 14 miles away. So I got a little bit of acquaintanceship with the community.
Well, you also started building a motorcycle.
Yeah. Well, I had gotten interested in motorcycles when I was in college.
I see.
And rode one back from school a couple times. Big old single-cylinder Norton 350.
Yeah.
But then I had bought a small James motorcycle when I was there.
Over in England?
In addition to an absolutely wretched Renault Dauphine, it's an eminently forgettable car if there ever was one. But I got acquainted with a guy down in London, a fellow named Mr. Skinner. I can't remember his first name. And he helped people with advice and parts to build hybrid motorcycles.
Yeah.
And this was something I thought would be fun.
By hybrid, you mean combining two different ones?
Different pieces.
Yeah.
In this case, Norton's had pretty good running gear and suspension, and Triumphs had solid engines, which Norton's didn't have. So I built this up, and it would have. I never rode it. Oh. I brought it home. Frantic last-minute packaging and crating and carrying it down to London in the middle of the night. But I never did really finish it. I ended up bailing it over to a guy who did some chimney work for me because he was interested in it, and it had been taking up space in our dining room and irritating the daylights out of Carla for several years. So I thought, let's cut our losses here.
Well, so you get out of the Air Force in about 1968.
Right.
And I imagine you haven't spoken of any love life or anything of that nature up to this point. You must be about, 60. You were born in 43,
I was about
so you're
25, 24,
yeah.
25
so
at the time.
So you should be getting interested in...
Well, it wasn't like I wasn't interested, but it was fair to say that I probably fit what we now call as the geek mold pretty well.
I see.
I wasn't, I was certainly not a chick magnet. I see. That's for sure. But when I got home, actually it was funny. I got off the plane in Dover, and I guess I took a bus home. But Mom and Dad were putting on a folk dance that night. Ah. And so I went. I was probably about 3/4 out of it by then, having just come across, for the last 24 hours I've been up.
Did your folks do folk dancing before you went to England? Is that how you got involved in square dancing in England, because you already knew about folk dancing, square dancing?
I hadn't done any square dancing before, but folk dancing, yeah. From the time Mom somehow got connected with the what's in this country is called the Country Dance Society of America. It's affiliated with the English Folk Dance and Song Society. And since about 52, we went to Berea. It was our main vacation every year. We went to Berea College in Kentucky. I think you're familiar with that.
I am familiar with that.
For what was called Christmas Country Dance School. And for, in our earlier years, we were mostly there as accessories, and we took a babysitter with us. And the rule was, when you got to be 5 feet tall, you could start dancing. So I'd been doing that for quite a while, and I especially enjoy the music.
Yeah.
It's interesting music. It was most of it custom written for dances. Sure. There were competitions among the English dancing masters, and I guess they sublet the music. I don't know, but there's a lot of interesting music.
Well, did you go back to school?
Yeah, almost immediately, but not quite. First I needed to get a job.
Yeah. Oh, okay.
And so I ended up, I applied several places and ended up going to work for what was then Melpar in Falls Church at the intersection of what's now the Beltway. It wasn't there. Let's see, was it? 60, yeah, the Beltway was already there, 62 or 63. At Route 50 in the Beltway in Falls Church. Yeah. And that turned out to be a good situation for me, but it sure didn't take long to realize that if I didn't get a degree, I wasn't going to get far. So I shopped around a little bit to see who I could get a degree with. The obvious choice was George Washington. I talked to them, and they said, well, in view of your record, I think we'll pass. And so eventually I ended up talking to an outfit that was called Capital Institute of Technology. They were over in Kensington in those days. Oh. And they said, well, you know, we'll take you. If you don't cut the mustard, we'll throw you out. So I said, fine, no problem.
It's your money.
It's your, yeah, that's right.
That's right.
And so I kind of had bit in my teeth at that point. I ended up graduating. I had to retake almost everything, but I ended up graduating about 5 years later, you know, because I had to go part-time.
Sure.
I was working part-time and going to school part-time.
That makes it rough. Yeah.
Well, it makes it long days.
Yeah.
Fortunately, Carla was working too, and at that time, she wasn't going to school. So I finished. I had kind of a chip on my shoulder, and I ended up with a 4-point average.
Great.
But you know, I would not go to that much trouble again.
But
I just wanted to prove
back to
a point
our other
to
earlier
myself.
conversation. Had you gone in the military before you went to the college,
yeah.
you might very well. You did.
Yeah.
Eventually, now you went back.
Well,
to college.
now I had an objective.
And now you had. That's absolutely.
Yeah,
right.
that was.
Did
and that, of course,
did you get
was
any
the point.
advanced degrees?
Well, I didn't for a while.
Yeah.
And then after I'd worked for a few more years, I said, well, you know, it seems like management is the way to go. So I better go back to school, and you know, I could do an engineering degree, but it looks like management would be better. So I did an MBA in management of technology and engineering. And that didn't prove to be all that useful. It wasn't the fault of the degree. It was just that I discovered eventually, after I'd been in management for a while, that although I enjoyed some aspects of management, I couldn't get away from wanting to do some of the work myself. Yeah. And when you got people working for you, you got to keep your hands off the work.
Absolutely.
So in the end, I ended up going back into working more or less as an individual contributor.
Where did you get your MBA from?
George Washington.
Oh, George. So they
were willing to
back
take me
then.
as well. That was a different school.
That's right. Okay.
Plus, I had an established record at that point, or maybe they needed the money. I don't know.
Well, could you tell us a little bit about your career in the Melpar building? You actually, there were 3 people that owned. Well, that
there were actually quite a few.
There were changes in ownership of the.
Yeah. Well, when I went in, Melpar had already been bought by Westinghouse Air Brake.
Okay.
And it and Wilcox Electric out in Kansas City were, I don't know how it worked because it was before I got there, but Westinghouse Air Brake somehow was interested in another outfit, and it got Melpar and Wilcox along the way. Eventually, we were divested, and we were bought up by LTV Electrosystems, which was kind of a company built on kited checks, or at least that's the way it felt. And then we were bought up by E-Systems, and E-Systems was it was a big Intel provider. But, you know, at some point, they couldn't figure out how to break out of that mold. Yeah. And so they ended up being bought by Raytheon. Yeah.
So
but it was the same work and the same customers at the same location.
Essentially, then, your work involved, I presume, classified work in communications, command and control, that kind of activity. And you were working for classified customers,
right?
As many of us did, and therefore you really can't tell us what you did, but that's basically.
That's you know, you could say with some assurance that if we were spying on somebody else, we probably had something to do with it, but that's about it.
Well, can you do you have any major accomplishments? What would you say your major accomplishment was throughout your career? Can you?
You know, oddly enough, I don't think it was my accomplishment so much. You know, one of the things that was very enjoyable, or really the best part of having people working for me, was hiring people and having them work out well. Yeah. And there were a couple people in particular that I was really proud of. And I thought, man, you know, these guys have really made something out of themselves, and I helped bring them in, and so wasn't that great? Yeah.
Did you have a philosophy maybe of trying to find people smarter than you?
Well, you know, it's hard to say. You know, I wouldn't say that I did that. I certainly wasn't looking for people dumber than me. But it was more a case of people. At that time, employment was longer lived.
Yeah.
I always told people, and it was true in those days, we're hiring people for a career.
Yeah.
We want you to be flexible enough that you can do a number of different things. You need to be able to work with other people. It just, it was a much more congenial situation, I think, then than it is now. It's become much more mechanized, for want of a better word.
Well, when did you quit working?
I stopped when I was 67. This was at the end of 2010.
Okay.
And I'd been working there for 43 years.
Yeah. So that's only a few years ago. So you really are aware of the current, pretty much the current system. All right. Well, you can't tell us anything about what you did.
Yeah, sorry.
What about your hobbies?
Well, I have a few.
Okay.
Maybe the most prominent one, at least as far as time goes, my wife would say the most time-consuming hobby known to man. That's not quite true, but that's the way she felt. I raced go-karts for years, several different varieties of them, but for 25, 26 years.
Let's show the folks what a go-kart is.
If you can see that.
Let's see. Maybe number one. Can you get it? So that's a go. You tell us about it.
Well, it's a relatively small, lightweight piece of equipment. It's about 6 feet long, weighs about 210 pounds. In this particular case, it's got a single-cylinder, water-cooled motorcycle engine, gearbox, in that case, about 40 horsepower. And it goes like a scalded cat.
How fast?
With that engine on a dry, cool day without riding behind somebody else, about 107.
107 miles an hour?
Yeah.
Holy mackerel. Man,
well,
protection either, huh?
Well, you're not likely to get thrown out, but it could happen. By the time you get to driving stuff like that, most people have got some age on them. This is not the kids who are 15. This is people who are 30, maybe.
All right, we're down to 1 minute.
Oh, okay,
Chuck.
sorry.
Can you imagine?
Can I imagine? No.
All right. Well, here at Green Spring, we talked about Green Spring just a bit, but not very much. I was impressed when you came to Green Spring by you identified a couple of problems and you went to work immediately trying to find out why the problems and how do we get it corrected and so forth. Did you get satisfactory answers to your questions?
In some cases, yes. In other cases, no.
Okay.
The management philosophy, I think, here is changing a little bit.
Okay.
Obviously, when you're in management, you can't have the inmates running the show. But
well, I don't know that we want to be referred to as inmates. We're residents.
Sorry. but you need to establish some credibility so people figure that you're not just stirring the pot. You're trying to do something useful. Well, it takes a little while to get that sorted out.
And so you understood that.
Yeah.
Well, and now you're on the sales and
information committee.
Liaison.
That's true.
To that, and so you're beginning to understand how things work.
Right.
But do you have anything that you would say now about Green Spring that?
I can't imagine why I had any real hesitation about moving here.
Oh.
I wasn't sure there was going to be enough to keep me busy. Boy, was that wrong.
All right, Chuck. Well, to sum up, it sounds to me like you've had an interesting life, and always interested in doing different things, and interested in the physical activities. You ride a bike around here and so forth. So you joined Diane, I guess, in bike riding. But anyway, she rides the bike too. Well, that's about all the time we have, Chuck.
Okay.
And I sure appreciate your having come on board with me.
And thank you for the opportunity.